Herbert Hoover, former President of the United States, once said, "Recently, in my opinion, there's been too much talk about the common man. It's been dinned into us that this is the century of the common man. The idea seems to be that the common man has come into his own at last. Thus we're in danger of developing a cult of the common man, which means a cult of mediocrity. But there is at least one hopeful sign. I've never been able to find out who this common man is. In fact, most people, and especially women, will get mad and fight if you try calling them common. This is hopeful because it shows that most people are holding fast to an essential fact of life. We believe in equal opportunity for all, but we know that this includes the opportunity to rise to leadership, in other words, to be uncommon. Let us remember that the great human advances have not been brought about by mediocre men and women. They were brought about by distinctly uncommon people with vital sparks of leadership. Many of the great leaders were, it is true, of humble origin, but that alone was not their greatness. It's a curious fact that when you get sick, you want an uncommon doctor. If your car breaks down, you want an uncommonly good mechanic. When we get into war, we want very much an uncommon admiral and an uncommon general. I've never met a father and mother who did not want their children to grow up to be uncommon men and women. May it always be so, for the future of the country rests not in mediocrity, but in the constant renewal of leadership in every phase of our national life. It's good, isn't it? You know, the kind, gentle, thoughtful person is the uncommon person. The person who willingly does for others with no thought of what's in it for him is the uncommon person. The person who lets you get your car into a busy traffic lane with a friendly smile and a wave of his hand is the uncommon man. The uncommon person is the person who does not thoughtlessly go along with those by whom he's surrounded. Instead, he thinks, is this right for me? Is this what I really want to do? He never falls into the error of believing that just because his friends and neighbors think and act a certain way, that he must think and act the same way. He knows that, though he may love them, they can be dead wrong, as he knows he can. The uncommon person doesn't confuse differences of opinion with permanent breaks of love or friendship. He may disagree totally with something his son or daughter does. He may throw up his hands in despair from time to time, but he will not let it affect or diminish his love for his children over the long haul. He knows they'll make mistakes just as he has, and that until he's achieved perfection, he should not look for it in others. The uncommon person is a good person to know, and a good person to be. Sinclair Lewis wrote, "That nation is proudest and noblest and most exalted, which has the greatest number of really great human beings." We need more uncommon people. Every person, in establishing the important goals of his life, should ask himself, now, if I establish that as my goal, what will it cost me? Dr. Francis J. Braceland, psychiatrist-in-chief of the country's largest private mental health organization, the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut, stresses that too often goals are established with no thought given to the cost. He says that a considerable proportion of man's illness is a function of his goals, his methods of attaining them, and the conflicts they engender. A man should realize what his actions and goals are costing him. Then, if he chooses, he may even pay for them in pain and disease. Often he'll decide that his values are poor, and that he's been confused, and thence change his direction and his pace. The so-called hard-bitten executive, who has no apparent weaknesses, may be paying for his bravado in some other way, probably physically, or even worse, his wife and children are paying for it. It's a sad thing to see a man make his way to the top and lose his family en route. He can explain to the family that he's really slaving because of them, but they'll often tell him they can do well with fewer material things if they can see more of him. This is particularly important when there are boys in the family. They need a masculine figure to emulate. How should one deal with his family as he climbs his way up the executive ladder? Well, don't put too much stock in trying to make them run like an efficient business organization. Tolstoy had one warning and suggestion. The trouble begins because men sometimes think that you can handle people without love, and you cannot. You can handle things without love. You can carve wood and hammer iron without it, but you cannot deal with people in this fashion. People are like bees. If you handle them roughly, either they will get hurt or you will get hurt. We can be sure that the greatest hope for maintaining equilibrium in the setting of worthwhile goals and in achieving them in the face of any situation rests within ourselves. Persons who are secure with a transcendental system of values and a deep sense of moral duties are possessors of values which no man and no catastrophe can take from them. Under all circumstances, These people will maintain their peace of mind, their position of human dignity, their self-respect, and their sense of duty. It would be worthwhile, the doctor goes on to say, for each of us to pause and take stock of himself. It would even make our jobs more meaningful. We might even find out, like Brutus, that the trouble is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Good advice. Nothing can be achieved without paying the price for it. Whatever you move over here will have a corresponding effect over there. People seem to often forget this. A man without a goal is like a ship without a rudder, but in choosing his goals, he needs to thoughtfully balance the cost. He must be true to himself, but he must also be true to those he has of his own free will involved in his life. The trouble begins because men sometimes think that you can handle people without love, and you cannot. You can handle things without love. You can carve wood and hammer iron without it, but you cannot deal with people in this fashion and succeed. Creative and productive people are not creative and productive for the benefit of others. It's because they're driven by the need to be creative and productive. They'd be creative and productive if they each lived on a deserted island and simply had to stack what he produced in a big pile with no one benefiting or even aware of what he was doing. You'll hear people say that we're happiest when we're serving others, and that's true, but it's not true because of any great altruism on our part. It's true because we experience the joy of producing something. That others benefit from it is fine, but only secondary. It's good to know that others benefit from and enjoy what we produce. There's satisfaction in that, ego satisfaction, and the desire to produce more. If everyone continually rejected our creative or productive efforts, we might become sullen and resentful. We might even stop all efforts for a while. But eventually, we'd begin to produce again in the hope that eventually someone would see the sense of what we're doing. This is the story of the painters who were before their time. Renoir, who was laughed at and rejected not only by the public but by his own fellow artists. We look at a painting by Renoir today and marvel that anything so fine and beautiful could have ever been an object of scorn. And he painted thousands of paintings. He went right on producing them. When he brought one of his canvases to one of the most eminent Parisian teachers, the expert glanced at the work and said, "You are, I presume, dabbling in paint to amuse yourself." And Renoir replied, "Of course. When it ceases to amuse me, I'll stop painting." Everything he painted delighted him, and he painted everything. Even Manet said to Monet, "Renoir has no talent at all. You who are his friend should tell him kindly to give up painting." A group of artists who were rejected by the establishment of their time formed their own association in self-defense. Do you know who were in that group? They were Degas, Pissarro, Monet, Cézanne, and Renoir. 5 of the greatest artists of all time, all doing what they believed in the face of total rejection. Since we're on the subject of Renoir, in his later life he suffered terribly, from rheumatism, especially in his hands. He lived in constant pain. And when Matisse visited the aging painter, he saw that every stroke was causing renewed pain, and he asked, "Why do you still have to work? Why continue to torture yourself?" And Renoir answered, "The pain passes, but the pleasure, the creation of beauty remains." One day when he was 78 and quite famous and successful, finally he said, "I'm still making progress." And the next day he was dead. This is the mark of a creative, productive person. Still making progress, still learning, still producing as long as he lives, despite pain or problems of all kinds. Not producing for the joy or satisfaction of others, but because he must, because it gives him pleasure and satisfaction. Some time back, there was a very popular play running in New York and Hollywood in which some of the actors appeared in the nude. You probably remember the play. It was called Hair. Groucho Marx was asked if he wanted to see it, and he said he took off his clothes and stood in front of the mirror for 4 minutes and decided not to go. It's the strangest thing about a nude human being. If there were a nude person, adult, in a cage in Times Square, millions would flock to see him. There would be hundreds deep around his cage. Why is that? If it's a naked orangutan or a naked elephant or a naked dugong, people will find it of only passing interest. The zoo is filled with naked creatures and in need of more customers. But let a human being divest himself of his clothes, and the curious and the concupiscent will come from miles around to look. In our big cities there are thousands with telescopes and binoculars scanning windows. You don't find them at the zoo, which is where they ought to be. And there's certainly no mystery to the human form. It's practically identical to that of the great apes. I remember reading a story many years ago about a society on some South Pacific island in which the women covered only their ears. Everyone went about completely naked except for the shells which young women wore over their ears. And when the young couple married and were alone finally in their hut, it was the new husband's right to remove the shells covering his young wife's ears, which act, as you might imagine, he found tremendously stimulating. If a large black box were placed in public view with a sign on it reading, "Do not look inside," well, you'd soon have a problem with the crowd. The people aren't interested in the naked animals in the zoo simply because they're naked all the time. People want to see what is customarily covered, and that, along with our attitudes towards sex, is what produces voyeurism on the part of millions of otherwise relatively normal human beings. People who live in nudist camps are, in my opinion, out of their minds, but at least there's no longer any need for the binoculars or standing in line to see a stage play in which members of the cast appear in the nude. The reason I say people who dwell in nudist camps are out of their minds is simply because it's much more comfortable and physically safer to wear clothes. Clothes for a human being take the place of the animal's coat or thick protective hide. It's much more comfortable to sit on the ground or a chair or a rough board with clothes on than it is without them. Moreover, the human being appears ridiculous without clothing unless love is there. Except for children, who are beautiful in any state, a very small percentage of adult human beings look good in the nude. The rest are ludicrous, and the kindest thing they can do is remain as fully clothed as possible, on the stage or off. Clothing was one of the greatest inventions of all time, and we should take full advantage of it. The next time you're intrigued by a play or motion picture in which the big deal is nudity, do what Groucho Marx did. Stand in front of a mirror with nothing on, and you'll probably decide not to go. On the occasion of his 75th birthday, Mark Van Doren, the American writer, poet, critic, and educator, was interviewed by a reporter for Life magazine, and one of the things he said stuck in my mind. I've saved this. He said, "It takes courage to be happy." And in those 6 words, he said a great deal. Any person can wallow in misery and self-pity. It's easy to rail against the world and its injustices. Easier still to sit down and do nothing like the famous hound dog with its tail in the crack. But it takes courage to be happy. When he said it takes courage to be happy, he didn't mean happiness today or tomorrow or a week from next Thursday. He meant to be happy as a general, relatively constant way of living. To be a happy person as opposed to a generally unhappy person. And it does take courage of a high order. The world is full, it seems, of the "it's too good to last" or "it's just my kind of luck" people who expect bad luck and rejection as confidently as they expect the sun to rise the next morning. They're people who were given bleak and disappointing starts in life. Tolstoy said man is meant for happiness, and this happiness is in him, in the satisfaction of the daily needs of his existence. And La Rochefoucauld said happiness is in the taste, and not in the things themselves. We're happy from possessing what we like, not from possessing what others like. Rudolph Flesch quotes Jane Austen, a passage that I think is very revealing. She wrote, "No temper could be more cheerful than hers, or possess in a greater degree that sanguine expectation of happiness, which is happiness itself." That sanguine expectation of happiness, which is happiness itself. It is in the expectation of happiness that much of happiness itself is found, and it takes courage to expect happiness. Balzac wrote, "All happiness depends on courage and work." I've had many periods of wretchedness, but with energy and above all with illusions, I pulled through them all. My old favorite, George Santa Anna, said happiness is the only sanction of life. Where happiness fails, existence remains a mad and lamentable experiment. Bertrand Russell put it well when he said, "Contempt for happiness is usually contempt for other people's happiness, and is an elegant disguise for hatred of the human race." The Chinese philosopher Lin Yutang said, "I've always been impressed by the fact that the most studiously avoided subject in Western philosophy is that of happiness." A French philosopher said much the same as did Mark Van Doren. He said, "To live, we must conquer incessantly. We must have the courage to be happy." We've all seen people seriously handicapped in one way or another who are wonderfully cheerful and happy people, and we've wondered how they do it. We've said to ourselves, "I don't think I could be happy if I had his or her affliction." These people are happy because they're courageous and because they don't like the alternative. Robert Louis Stevenson, a real expert in the happiness department, despite his affliction, said there's no duty we so much underrate as the duty of being happy. One of the enriching blessings of growing older all the time is that it has a way of improving one's sense of humor, or at least it should. The person without a good sense of humor is a person to avoid as though he were a known carrier of the bubonic plague. Horace Walpole once said, "I have never yet seen or heard anything serious that was not ridiculous." Now take your time on that one, but the longer you think about it, the truer and the funnier it becomes. It's worth repeating. I have never yet seen or heard anything serious that was not ridiculous. And Samuel Butler said, the one serious conviction that a man should have is that nothing is to be taken seriously. It's been said that seriousness is the only refuge of the shallow. Oscar Wilde said it's a curious fact that the worst work is always done with the best intentions, and that people are never so trivial as when they take themselves very seriously. I remember when I was in the service, the toughest job I had was to keep from laughing at the wrong times, during an admiral's inspection, for example. There's nothing funnier than the seriousness of the military, especially high-ranking military. The fancy costumes, the panoply, the shining sabers, the serious faces, it was all to me hilariously funny. As Oscar Wilde said, people are never so trivial as when they take themselves very seriously. We can be serious about situations. When a youngster is ill or hurt, or somebody says the wrong thing to your wife, you can get very serious about the situation in a hurry. But that's not taking ourselves seriously. That's different. The thing that bothered me about Hemingway, as much as I admired his work, and still do, was that I thought he tended to take himself too seriously. He didn't seem to be able to laugh at himself, and I think he suffered. I think his work suffered from this flaw in his character. I found it a good rule of thumb to be slightly suspicious of anyone who takes himself too seriously. There's usually something fishy there someplace. I think this is why we love children so much. Life is a game to them. They'll do their best at whatever work is given them, but they never seem to lose their ebullient sense of humor. There's always a sparkle of humor in their eyes. When a child lacks this, he's usually very sick or in need of help. Dictators are famous for their lack of humor. The mark of the cruel person is that he doesn't seem to be able to see anything funny in the world. And speaking of a sense of humor, this was what was so great about Mark Twain. No matter how serious the subject, he could find the humor in it and bring it out. Will Rogers, too. All the great comedians have this ability to see what's funny in the so-called serious situation. They can poke fun at themselves. And the study of humor is one of the most interesting. What makes people laugh? There are those who believe that a sense of humor is the only thing that has kept the human race from totally extinguishing itself. So keep your sense of humor at all costs. As the man says, you wouldn't be as concerned about what other people think of you if you realized how seldom they do. Lin Yutang, the famous Chinese philosopher, has written, "We don't know a nation until we know its pleasures of life, just as we do not know a man until we know how he spends his leisure. It is when a man ceases to do the things he has to do and does the things he likes to do that the character is revealed. It is when the repressions of society and business are gone, and when the goads of money and fame and ambition are lifted, and a man's spirit wanders where it listeth, that we see the inner man, his real self." Have you ever thought much about that? Your leisure gives you away. I used to know a man who was head of a very large commercial empire. Beginning with nothing but ambition, he became a multimillionaire and finally retired as head of this far-flung company. He bought a large and magnificent yacht with which to cruise the world. And do you know what he did with his free time? He read salacious paperbacks and got falling down drunk and had to be carried to bed unconscious every night. He's dead now. His leisure gave him away. There was nothing there, just nothing at all. He was a one-idea man. Once he was away from that idea, he was a lost child in the wilderness. He didn't enjoy his yacht or travel. Travel meant nothing to him. He was a pitiful, unhappy cipher, not because he was rich. There are thousands, millions just like him in every walk of life. It was just that his millions, which gave him access to the whole world, were worthless to him and accentuated his nothingness. The thing that's always bothered me is how a human being can live for 30 or 40 or 50 years and find no interest, no charm and excitement in the world. Talk about wearing blinders. I guess it has to do with the way a person looks at life. If it's nothing more to him than getting through one day after another as best he can, well, that's one thing. But if he's searching for meaning, well, that's something else. It doesn't mean he'll find it, but the search, the journey itself, can be filled with interest. When FDR first took office as President of the United States, one of his first acts was to visit the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was admitted to the old jurist's quarters and found him reading Plato. Justice Holmes was in his 90s. "Why are you reading Plato, Mr. Justice?" the President asked. "To improve my mind, Mr. President," the great judge replied. "To improve my mind." What do you do with your leisure time? It's a good idea to examine carefully this important segment of your life. It exposes the real person, but not the finished person. We can change. We can, like Justice Holmes, still be growing and improving our minds at 92. It doesn't mean we need to read Plato, although it's an excellent idea. But to find fulfillment, meaning, and interest, we need to grow towards something. When we stop growing, like my millionaire friend with the big yacht, we get sick and die. We may stick around a few more years and go through the motions, but for all practical purposes, we really cease to live. We don't know a man until we know how he spends his leisure. It's when a man ceases to do the things he has to do and does the things he likes to do that the character is revealed. It is then we see the inner man, his real self. There's a cute little gal in New York, a public relations executive in her 20s, who has said some interesting things about the so-called youth market. In an editorial in Pace magazine, she wrote, "To me, the youth market just doesn't exist. It's a myth, and I feel myths should be recognized as myths before they infiltrate our thinking. Today, forcefully or passively, we're acting to obliterate historical major myths nurtured here for too long about people, about success, about education, government, sex, lifestyle, personal relationships. Myths impose, they limit. Nothing should ever be imposed except those things that encourage an individual to find out what he or she wants to do and grow toward. A youth market concept limits. A youth market concept is really a nice, neat rationalization for change. It's a nice, neat rationalization for the need for new thinking at all levels. What does exist and is real is an entire population of all ages that's bored and a marketplace that's kind of boring to buy in. But if the pervading youth market concept isn't what necessitates good and imaginative thinking, then what is? Well, I call it, she writes, the avant-garde buyer. A contemporary buyer in a contemporary marketplace. There are no age limits, but a need for quality. An avant-garde buyer is anyone who would enjoy seeing good thinking applied to the marketplace, anyone who wants what's good and imaginative in design, manufacture, function, promotion. Manufacturers, management, advertisers, retailers miss this completely. Their youth-oriented products, promotion, and advertising campaigns are usually out of date or not risky enough to appeal. They use methods the avant-garde buyer sees through. Right now, there's a plethora of unexciting and look-alike alternatives to choose from, and a lack of exciting, fresh, and imaginative ones. It's not only products that are on the line, but entire company images and policies as well. Avant-garde buyers are literally front-running buyers. Watch them creating needs, obliterating facts and enforcing obsoleteness for the sake of eventually getting what they want. They think things can be made beautifully and to last if they're designed and manufactured well in the first place. They expect those items to be promoted, advertised, and publicized beautifully, simply because the product is valid. If an avant-garde buyer doesn't see what he wants in the marketplace, he'll design and manufacture it himself, not for the sake of ego, but for the sake of getting what he's looking for. And then Patricia Cox writes, I'd rather sew my clothes than buy clothes in any store in Manhattan. They just don't sell what I want, and most of my friends feel this way too. What all this means is the necessity for deep changes in the heads of the people who want dollars and have products to sell to the general market. Forget the myth of the youth market. People who are lured by the so-called youth market run the risk of trying to turn on an entire market that has no artificial age dividers, a contemporary market composed of avant-garde buyers who relish quality. I took my small son and one of his young friends on a 4-day trip to northern Michigan to the cottage of my old friend Bud Irish of Saginaw. Just the two young boys and me to fish and boat on the lake, take long walks, and swim in the crystal-clear, clean water on the sandy beach. I'd fix us a big breakfast every morning and provide the sandwiches at midday, and in the evening we'd drive to a nearby village for a big dinner. Most of the time I spent putting worms on tiny hooks and unhooking bluegills and perch and tossing them back into the lake. The boys loved it and gave me time to get away from the city and think. I took along a couple of good books, one of which I'd like to mention now. Beyond the Observatory, by the distinguished emeritus professor of astronomy at Harvard University, Harlow Shapley. Much more than a great scientist, he's a humanitarian and philosopher. In his book, he points out that galaxies, a few decades ago, were hazy patches of light concerning which we had only hazy notions or no thoughtful interpretation at all. Now they're recognized as stupendous accumulations of stars, one of which we conceitedly call our galaxy. Man, the so-called crowning glory of creations, is revealed to be peripheral, off-center, in one galaxy among uncounted millions. The whole world of galaxies, now called the meta-galaxy, is expanding in all directions, doubling in size every few hundred years. In the field of cosmography, there are the newly discovered quasars and other queer objects that seem to be millions of times bigger than the stars and a billion times brighter. There's something mysterious here that transcends the present theories about galaxies and their spaces. A fishing trip is a good time to think about such things. As Harlow Shapley put it, it is indeed a grand time to be alive and asking questions. Now that we're reaching toward the stars with manned flight, we're going to be making some very interesting discoveries. I've often thought at how amazed a visitor from outer space might be by the creatures of our Earth. Imagine trying to describe an elephant in a notebook. He'd take a picture of it and write its dimensions along with a comment that while this is the largest land animal, there are creatures swimming in the seas of Earth whose tongues weigh as much as the elephant, as does that of the great blue whale. The more you think of life, from the smallest submicroscopic creatures such as those that live in the intestines of termites, to the largest, to man himself and his frightening and wonderful brain, and see all life on Earth, and Earth itself in its place in one of billions of galaxies, as you think of this and watch two small boys playing in the water, you're filled with awe. You realize that the Pacific Ocean is not even a glistening drop of moisture in the greater creation, that our Earth is only a speck of dust in the whirling winds of time and space. There are, as Dr. Shapley says in his book, scientific discoveries just ahead that will help to revise our knowledge of space, time, and matter. The discoveries could be mind-reading, stunning. And taking a small boy fishing is a good way to put the world back into perspective. You don't understand any more than you did before, but at least whatever problems you might have had have a way of fading into insignificance.